his book, What Is to Be Done. In it, he raised the idea of the relationship of the particular to the general, or the specific to the universal. And this is something that Lenin picks up a lot on. How do we make sense of the culture that's around us? Because culture is both unifying and universal, and under capitalist media, totalitarian, but at the same time there exists the possibility for independent negotiations with that. So how do we frame ourselves? We go backwards and forwards between the reference points that frame us, and then empowered, we go back into that discourse and hopefully change it. So that's why I think that Hewitt was so in awe of Aragon, because he had that power. He used Marxist-Leninist theory to emancipate himself, to empower himself within the field that he worked, the field of arts, and attempted to change the economic base through the superstructure. Now we know that sort of attempts to do that are always going to be doomed, because the superstructure is incredibly fluid. It's always, kind of to use Marxist terms, it's always in a state of flux. But at the same time, that is what activism in the superstructure can actually do. It can help to change and to modify material circumstances. Now, if you haven't had a look at this, then please do. This is a history of the Perth Workers' Art Guild written by Dylan Hyde, recently published, and in it he examines the way in which the Perth Workers' Art Guild wrote articles, wrote poems, mounted plays, had discussion groups, were forever active in the cultural superstructure, trying to change the ways in which people thought about the world that they found themselves in materially. So it was a dialectical process. I was going to talk a bit more about this, but I think the easiest thing at this point, this stage in the afternoon, is simply say, go and buy this and sort of hear about these figures. Harold Vike, a Norwegian seaman that ended up in Perth, worked in the arts here, was a member of the party, ultimately ended up as a stage designer for one of the early TV companies out in the eastern states. He worked with the trade union movement. And one of the things about working in the superstructure is that we know, and I'm going to go back to this in just a moment, we know that meaning fluctuates. Now we can say that there are material circumstances in the economic base, and we understand the remorseless, brutal logic of it. But once you have an image that floats around in the superstructure, the context of the superstructure changes the way in which it's read. So we cannot have an absolute reading of imagery. We cannot have an absolute understanding of the ideas that are floating around in a creative, sometimes crystallized, sometimes unformed state. That their meaning floats. And a good example of this is Vike's work with the trade union movement. Committed communist, he was determined to negate the usual approach of representing workers as kind of disempowered, marginalized people. He wanted to put the worker at the center of his imagery as autonomous, as strong, as authoritative. And he adopted a whole series of images for the trade union banners that he painted in the 1930s and 40s in Perth of empowered men, to the extent that the Butchers' Union burned their banner because the worker on their banner, they said, was a little too handsome, a little too muscular, and he looked like a puff there. So we have this real problem with imagery. How does imagery find a home? How does imagery rest into a place in which it has authority? And someone like Aragon would say, of course, that it doesn't. And this is why Hewitt kept going back to Aragon. The idea that when you have an image that stands in for something, when you have an image that represents something other than itself, when it becomes metaphorical, it's really, really difficult to pin it down and to use it. And we see all kinds of ways in which the left tied itself into knots to try and pin down what was legitimate to represent and a legitimate way to represent it. So here's one of Harold Weich's paintings, a generic trope of his. Whoa, I'm well over already, sorry.
No, you're okay.
It was, to us, this looks like a piece of sort of realism. In the 40s, in sort of the Soviet Union, this would have been criticized as a piece of bourgeois formalism because the way in which the painting is structured, the way that we structure images in the arts is usually to divide things in half. Here it is divided in half by something that is actually in the foreground rather than in the background. This could easily be categorized as bourgeois formalism. So we end up, it's like a medieval discourse, the angels dancing on the head of a pin. This is Leith Angelo. I'll just whip through all this now. Leith Angelo was the artist who recruited Weick to the party. This is a watercolour of Bunbury. And there was never any problem with Leith Angelo. He conformed to all the kind of notions of what realism should look like, to the point of becoming almost anodyne. Sort of, is this a radical revolutionary work of art? It's painted by a communist. It represents lived experience. Does it empower? Does it kind of dislodge the structures around us? These are things that are always up for discussion. And Herbert McClintock, who shared a studio with Harold Weick, and they both had a studio 221 William Street, just across the road from where we are now. He took the view of Aragon. He took the view that surrealism was a mechanism for political liberation. This is The City Wakes Up. Kind of, he saw himself as a committed member of the Communist Party. When he went to live in Melbourne, he fell under the dead hand of Noel Counihan and started to paint sort of very, very generic images of a dispossessed working class. There's actually a Noel Counihan on the back there, if anybody's interested to have a look. So if we go back to what is particular and what is general, that has to be negotiated. How does the individual negotiate their relationship with culture? If you are a radical, if you want to disrupt the status quo, how do you do that? Do you adopt a radical aesthetic that no one can understand? Do you spend your whole life saying, look at me, I'm alienated, look at me, I'm alienated? Because that was always the criticism, and a legitimate one, of modern art from the left. So here's a painting of Lenin in his study in Perth. There's a map of the Swan River behind him on the wall. There's some kangaroo paws on the table. He has the kind of reading. There's Mayakovsky on the table there, and he's reading a book about Picasso. How do we own again? How do we reclaim that revolutionary history? How do we claim images to give them a potency that relates to our own context? So what I've been doing is repainting socialist realist pictures of Lenin and putting them in a West Australian context. So here's another one, Lenin with a kangaroo buttonhole. Of course, I'm not the only person that does stuff like this. Marek Seisler painted a picture of Lenin with "A Better World is Possible" hat in the characteristic pose of Trump. And here we have the problem. At what point do these images start to float and become reinterpreted so they start to say the opposite thing? And this is always a problem working in a superstructure. Is this a celebration of Lenin, or is it a criticism of him? It becomes difficult. And this very quickly leads me on to the idea of the images of Lenin that are increasingly flooding the internet. And the majority of them are positive. And they're positive, and they reframe him in a humorous way. And we don't have to feel embarrassed about that. All we have to do is go back to Lenin's article, Better Fewer But Better. Have I said that? I can't. Yep. Thank you. Better Fewer But Better, where he says we use every tool in our armory. We use humour if we need to dismantle the structures that frame us. So here's, I think, one of my favourite paintings ever of Lenin riding a unicorn. How can you not fall in love with that? And memes become increasingly dispersed across the internet, picked up by youth who are using the superstructural mechanisms that are there for them. Who goes to an art gallery? Put up your hands if you've been to an art gallery in the last 3 months. Off, look at you. Intellectuals. I'm not used to audiences who are intellectuals. Usually there's a absolute sort of zero. So, but if you want to communicate en masse, then it's really difficult to sort of communicate through the arts themselves. We have to use the mechanisms that are available to us. So here's one, here's another. This is Bob the Builder. And these, of course, if you grew up with Bob the Builder, I didn't, obviously, but my children did. Kind of this has another a resonance. We start to build up networks of meaning, building up we use these terms, I think that they still have a legacy of the antique about them. We can build consciousness. Now, someone who's worked in a coal mine and been harassed by men with guns will look at stuff like this and go, oh, please. You know, there's a blunt end to imperialism. And yes, we acknowledge that. But at the same time, the superstructure is there like a huge forest to sort of use and harvest the various parts for ourselves. We'll miss that bit, and we'll just close on Star Trek fans will know this. It's a meta meme. Okay, thank you. Dr. Whitehead, the floor is yours.
I'll try not to keep it too long. Following what Dr. Crouch has just said, I think Pritchard is a real, true artist. She never wavered from what she wrote. Right, most Australians know Catherine Susanna Pritchard for her novels and plays, and a few perhaps for her political activities in the peace movement and the women's movement. She was not only a novelist and an activist, but one of our early radical educators, which came from her being a communist and a founding member of the Communist Party of Australia. She had a unique ability to be able to use her art as a bridge across cultural barriers and as a barometer of history, a skill she shared with other writers of her generation, such as Hemingway, Tennessee Williams, and our own Ray Lawler. Her life captured the links between the independent educational work of the socialist movement of the previous decades and the work the CPA undertook in its first decade. Especially important is the connection between the CPA's educational office efforts, and the Labour College movement in America. Right. Catherine was born in Fiji because her father Tom worked there as a newspaper editor. His ongoing search for work took him and his family to Launceston and then Melbourne, where he was editor of the Sun newspaper. The family experienced hard times due to his uncertain employment and subsequent fits of depression, which she blamed on the social system. From a young age, she was aware of extreme poverty existing alongside obscene wealth. Nothing changes. Even as a child, Catherine was staging plays, but her first major play, The Burglar, was produced for the Australian Drama Night in 1910. In it, a young woman disturbs a burglar in her bedroom and gives him long speeches about socialism. She wrote many plays over the years, including a suffragette play written in London just before the First World War. Although intellectually gifted, her family's poverty meant her brothers would benefit from further education, while Catherine, who had gained a university entrance, was forced to become a governess. Undeterred, she attended evening lectures at the University of Melbourne, studying, amongst other things, economics and the history and policies of the Australian Labour Party. She became interested in the Fabian Society of George Bernard Shaw and the Webbs, real socialism, syndicalism, and the anarchism of Kropotkin. Her philosophical reading replaced Christianity with rationalism. The foundation for her successful literary career was her lifelong habit of keeping journals, and through her plays and novels she revealed the complexities of the early 20th century. Catherine knew the slums of Melbourne and heard stories from the Anti-Sweating League of young women working long hours on high-pressure machines for low wages. She learned of women being forced to submit to sexual advances from bosses in order to take work home to earn an extra shilling making clothes, and her later novels and plays often referred to social inequality. After the death of her father from suicide in 1907, she went to work as a journalist in London, Paris, and North America. In 1913, she published a small collection of poetry, Clavelli verses, and in 1915 won £250 in Hodden Stoughton's All-Empire novel competition for the Pioneers, based on her Australian notebooks. Both brothers served in the First World War, and the loss of her elder brother Alan hardened her resolve to work for peace, and in her own words, oppose political and economic intrigues which foster the barbarous insanity of war. The Russian Revolution introduced her to the theories of Marx and Engels, which gave a structure for her thoughts on reorganising the social system. Poverty, oppression and war left a great impression on her. She understood the importance of mateship and unionism to the working class, and her work reflected what she saw as this distinctive Australian culture. Injustice shaped her consciousness, and engrossed by the philosophy of Marx and aware of the improvements in the lives of the Russian people which the Bolshevik Revolution had begun, she founded the Communist Party of Australia along with Christian Jolly Smith and Guido Balaci in 1920. Her artistic inspiration constantly interacted with her political analysis of a rapidly changing Australia, and her novels and plays always revealed the society she knew and understood. Her first published writings had appeared in New Idea in 1903, which published Bushfires, a prize-winning love story. And in 1908 she wrote a semi-autobiographical children's novel, The Wild Oats of Han, which was first published as a serial in Australia's Home Journal from July 1926 to May 1927, and finally published in 1928. It focused on her resentment of poverty and the experience of seeing bailiffs clearing her family's home. In 1916, while in London, she met Lieutenant Hugo, Jim Fossil, VC, and married 3 years later, settling in Freemount outside Perth. Here, Catherine established a Labour study circle, produced a son, Rick, in 1922, and 4 years later secured her reputation as a writer capable of revealing the essence of Australia with the novel Working Bullocks. Working Bullocks dramatise the lives of timber workers in the Carey forest of the southwest of WA, demonstrating the essence of the alienating processes denying the working class the product of their labour, and so becoming the bullocks of the title. She won the Triad Play competition with her powerful political play Brumby Innes in 1927, which dealt with the issues of sexism, racism, class injustice, and the rape of the environment, all issues still alive and well today. In 1929, a more controversial novel, Cooladoo, followed, and was probably the first novel to humanise Indigenous culture and show the injustice of the attempted destruction of an entire peoples. The 20s were Catherine's most productive time, and she wrote her most adventurous novels, stories and plays. At this time, as an active communist, she helped organise unemployed workers and left-wing women's groups. Her return to Perth in 1919 on her honeymoon coincided with the Wharfish strike, where mounted police attacked the strikers, killing one and wounding several. So she spoke on the waterfront, the first encounter between a Marxist and Australian striking workers, and later gave lectures on Marxism. In Melbourne, she'd been associated with a group who wanted to form a communist party, one of whom was Bill Ersman, the Scots engineer. With the founding of the party in Australia in Sydney in October 1920, Bill asked her to form study circles in WA, and urged by Monty Miller, she wrote her first political pamphlet, The New Order, in response to the demand for accessible information on Marxism. As you probably know, Monty was a veteran of the 1853 Eureka Stockade, and in 1917, aged 73, had been put on trial for his international workers of the world activities. Catherine was very aware of being middle class and having a father-in-law who was, in her words, a bourgeois politician, a former Premier of WA. So to help her set up Labour Study Circle, she asked George Rice, an engineer working as a fitter in the Midlands Railway workshops, to work with her. The 30s saw her actively campaign to support the Spanish Republic and other socialist causes. Her commitment to left-wing politics did not endear her to the conservative society dominating the Perth art scene at the time, which doesn't seem to have changed much. And throughout her life, she endured a certain social exclusion, but her good friends were other free-thinking intellectuals, also challenging the social norms of the time. The study circles received good attendances, mostly from workers, and the lectures were then published weekly in the West Australian Worker and in the Communist, the Sydney paper of the party. Catherine wrote The Materialist Conception of History and Marx, The Man, His Work. The Workers' Education Association also wanted her to lecture, but she refused, writing a letter in 1921, which really shows the woman, saying, "Educational enterprises subsidised by agents of the capitalist system cannot be expected to, and do not, present history and economics except as a fiction agreed upon." In the Labour study circles, the workers are undertaking their own education. The basis of this education, therefore, should be the study of the facts of history and economics which vitally concern them. What a woman. The study circles ran for 18 months, because in 1922, Catherine had their son Nick. She then travelled to the northwest of the state, living on a remote cattle station and researching for Cooladoo, her book about Aboriginal/colonial relations. And it's brilliant, I'm just reading it. In 1930, she helped set up the Modern Women's Club, now seen as a precursor to the feminist movement and the women's electoral lobby. However, while in the Soviet Union in 1933, collecting material for the Real Russia, Catherine's husband, Jim Fossell, committed suicide, as had many others during the Great Depression. His real estate business and other ventures left the family with colossal debts. Prior to this trip, she'd written a draft of Intimate Strangers, in which the male character, Greg Blackwood, had suicide. So being concerned this might be construed as having influenced Jim's suicide, she altered the ending and deferred its publication for 4 years. On her return, Catherine became involved with the movement against war and fascism, founded that year. During the 30s, she was an unremitting worker for the Communist Party, writing Who Wants War in 1935, and agitprop plays such as Women of Spain in 1937 and Penalty Clause in 1940. With Jean Devaney, she set up the Writers' League in 1935 and was a founding member of the West Australian branch of the Fellowship of Australian Writers. In an attempt to relieve her debts in 1941, she wrote the novel Moon of Desire, aimed at Hollywood. Altogether, she published 13 novels between 1915 and 1967. This is from Nathan Hopper's research into Pritchard. His book is to be published by Melbourne University Press next year. He writes that literature and politics were always interacting in her life and work. The clash and confluence of the two are both apparent in her 10-week research trip to the gold mining town of Kalgoorlie in 1941. Much of our knowledge of Pritchard's trip is thanks to files kept by two government agencies, the Commonwealth Literary Fund, which gave her a grant, and the other, the Intelligence Service, which was surveilling her, revealing the tensions in Australia at this time. The trip encompassed two forms of dirt, the dirt of the mining industry and the dirt file being kept on her as a dangerous radical. She arrived in Kalgoorlie in late May 1941, and while there worked long days reading copies of the Kalgoorlie Miner from 1897 to 1919 in the mornings, and then chatting with prospectors, miners, mine managers, and interesting folks of all sorts, which added riches to the material she'd been gathering for a year. Her Goldfield saga would eventually be published as a trilogy: The Roaring Nineties in 1946, Golden Miles in 1948, and Winged Seeds in 1950. Catherine was careful in writing letters to friends at this time, as she suspected the authorities would be reading her mail. A year earlier, on the 15th of June 1940, the Menzies government had declared the Communist Party of Australia illegal. The next day, detectives raided her Greenmount home and confiscated a large trunk of material. So she was deliberately evasive and misleading about political matters, because in reality, she was still on the state committee of the underground Communist Party, and her political activity was as intense as ever. The Communist Party was still illegal in Australia, but suddenly the Soviets joined the Allies. Having never mentioned her presence in Kalgoorlie before, the Kalgoorlie Miner suddenly carried two separate articles about her, mentioning a lecture she was to give and a cable she'd received from the Soviet Union. 300 people turned out at the Boulder Workers' Hall to listen to her 1-hour talk on her 1933 visit to Russia and her impressions of the country and its people. In 1942, Catherine moved to Sydney to be closer to her son Rick, who was serving in the military, and this also allowed her to serve on the CPA Central Committee for a 2-year term. In late 1944, she sent off the manuscript of The Roaring Nineties, which, because of wallpaper shortages, wasn't published until 1946. She felt that her Goldfields trilogy was her supreme achievement because she had finally successfully synthesised politics and literature. Last one, sorry, I hope you haven't got numb bums. Catherine's Goldfields trilogy was set in the Goldfields from 1890 to 1946 and provides a substantial reconstruction of social and personal histories reflecting her political philosophy that no one is immune from war, disease, and the ruthless struggle for wealth and power which sweeps people up into a maelstrom of economic and national crises. And she wrote her autobiography, Child of the Hurricane, in 1963. Aged 84, her last novel, which we mentioned, Peter, Subtle Flame, was published in 1967. Set in Melbourne towards the end of the Korean War and around the Peace Conference of 1959, is a story about the inner meaning of life, the struggle of man's integrity and the influence of society. The book is a passionate plea for world peace and is now considered an important social document. She was awarded the World Council Silver Medal for Peace in 1959. Catherine Susanna Pritchard pioneered the Australian novel as a viable art form. In a letter written to Vic Williams, she had hoped her works would help people realise the future they could create for Australia. She died at her home in Greenmount in 1969, and her ashes are scattered in the surrounding hills. I wonder what she'd make of our country today, with even worse inequality, where greedy materialism are gods, and our government spends trillions on armaments.
Thank you very much. And
Could I just, I'm sorry, add one thing? Catherine, during her research in the goldfields, she lived with my cousins and my grandparents, and also Bruce Douglas and his wife. Bruce was a member of the Communist Party of the Kalgoorlie branch. But she also, two of the characters in her books of Goldfields, she modelled on his father and my mother.
Wonderful.
fantastic. A glimpse into the future. Seamus, Carey. So I turn this off.
Turn it up.
Turn it off.
We're going to play the internationality.
I'll leave that there. So I'd like to talk from the perspective of the next generation of the party. I'd first like to acknowledge we're meeting here on Aboriginal land, the land of the Whadjuk Noongar Boodja, and pay my respects to all of the peoples of this country. Comrades, over the last weeks we have reflected upon the last 100 years, or rather the first 100 years of our party. I'd like to talk about the next 100, about the need for us to continue the work of building the party, the need for a strong Marxist-Leninist party in Australia, the need for revolution and socialism. More and more people of my generation are waking up to the fact that their life prospects are looking decidedly dimmer than those of their parents' generation. Precarious employment, benefits stripped away piece by piece, increasingly expensive but poorer quality education, outrageous cost of housing, cultural and political degradation, environmental disaster, war. Who knows what things will be like for our children? These experiences of working class people confirm day by day that the capitalist system is not in our interest to maintain. We must fight to replace it. This is the cause that thousands upon thousands of Australian communists armed with Marxism-Leninism have struggled for a century, and we must continue to do so until the cause is won. To achieve this, we must get organised, adopt the scientific outlook and theory, and act always according to the genuine interests of the working class, never becoming distracted or losing focus. This is a long and arduous struggle, but it moves in sudden leaps. We must develop ourselves and build our party to be capable of playing the leading role in these struggles. Why this party? That is, why are we who are members of this party? Well, of course, there are as many specific paths here as there are members, but I think there is a core fact held in common. We are members because we know we have to be. We know we have to be because we know Marxism-Leninism is true, and the Communist Party of Australia is the Marxist-Leninist party in Australia. We know that Marxism-Leninism is not just a truth to be pondered, but a compelling call to action, and that means building a party to lead the working class to seize power from the exploiters and build a socialist future. This task is becoming ever more urgent as consequences of moribund capitalism like war and environmental destruction take us closer to the destruction of humanity. What is our party and what must it be? I believe our party is distinguished by four main characteristics. Firstly, its class character, which is proletarian. As Marx and Engels expressed in 1847, printed 1848, we have no interests aside those of the working class. A key area of our work in maintaining and deepening this character is our work in trade unions and other mass organisations. Secondly, our ideological character, which is Marxist-Leninist. This is also necessary to maintain our class character politically, as having a scientific outlook and theory is necessary to overcome the dominance of bourgeois ideology in our society. Thirdly, our national character, which is Australia. This means we seek to adapt Marxism-Leninism creatively to Australian conditions and build a unique socialism according to the real conditions of Australia. This also means that we must understand the realities of the development process of the Australian nation and recognise the original peoples of this land, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, who never ceded sovereignty, and achieve just reparations for the historical and continuing crimes of colonisation and build a new, fairer Australia for all its peoples. Fourthly and finally, our position in the international movement. Our party is independent of all other parties and respects their independence, whilst also seeking to deepen the ties of international solidarity and cooperation, and recognising that we do form a single international movement, or a single international party, as you might say. My experiences in the Communist Party of Australia have inspired in me perfect faith that this is the party capable of embodying these characteristics. This is the party, modest as our current circumstances might be, that we must build into the revolutionary leadership of the Australian working class. This cannot be achieved by idle declarations, but must be earned through long-term commitment, consistency and hard work. Constant dripping wears away a stone. In our party, I've met so many inspiring people, some of the best, most sincere, dedicated, hard-working people I've ever met, with a wealth of collective wisdom. And today I see us gaining many new young members who are wise beyond their years and ready to commit to our life of struggle. I believe the future looks bright for our party. Thank you, comrades. Long live socialism, long live Marxism-Leninism, long live the Communist Party of Australia.
All the future's bright.